Almighty Father, we pray that you bless this video, that you give me the ability to communicate these ideas in a way that makes sense to the viewers. And Lord, we pray that you bless everybody taking time out of this video to try and figure out this world that we live in. And we pray that you give us guidance as we try and wrestle with these difficult economic and spiritual concepts. So today we're going to be discussing the Federal Reserve, and before I really dive into this, I want to make a couple caveats. The first being that most of the information I'm getting about the Fed is from G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, and he also gives a YouTube lecture on the book. So if you don't want to go buy the book, but you're still interested in these concepts, you can just watch him give the lecture on YouTube. And I really encourage people who are interested in the kind of financial aspect of the conspiracy to look into the Federal Reserve more in depth, because I am not an economist, but I'm going to be talking about kind of a very broad overview of our monetary policy and the fiscal policy of the U.S. And I might, these are difficult concepts to understand, and I encourage people, if I make any mistakes, to point out different areas where I could do some more research on. But we're starting off with a quote from Charles Lindbergh, and for those of you familiar with Lindbergh, he was famous for flying across the Atlantic. He was one of the first people to ever do it in such a short amount of time, and the longest distance. And so basically he spoke out against the Federal Reserve System in 1913, which was the year that the Federal Reserve System was enacted. And another thing about Lindbergh was he was the victim of what is called the crime of the century, which is basically where his infant son was kidnapped and then murdered. And in the conspiracy world, the kind of suspicion is that because Lindbergh was speaking out against the elite and against these conspiracies, and he couldn't be bought, and he had occupied this kind of position of fame and power from crossing the Atlantic, and then he was a congressman, so the elite kind of had to use their muscle on him, and they did it by killing his kid. And of course, that remains a mystery and a conspiracy, but it's something, we should be aware of. And this slide shows the actual clubhouse that the Federal Reserve System and the operating documents were drafted in the early 20th century in 1913. And this is a quote from James Warburg, who, again, people dismiss the one world government conspiracy as something so crazy. But if you really look into the facts, you'll see that the people who have been pushing this are very, very open about their desire to have a new world order and a one world government. And the Warburg family, extremely powerful banking family, they had a representative at the meetings on Jekyll Island where the Federal Reserve was created. So the Warburgs represented the Rothschilds. It was several banking kind of dynasties that met in Jekyll Island to draft the Federal Reserve, and they left in secret. They used pseudonyms, and so basically the point of all this is to show that the whole Federal Reserve System was controversial from the get-go, and they really, tried to hide it. And if there's one thing you'll learn going into the conspiracy world, is that secrets and deception and all kinds of tricks are kind of the standard operating procedure in this shadowy world. So they enacted the Federal Reserve, and so basically the significance of the Federal Reserve System is that it's a central bank for the United States. And those of you who remember, U.S. history will remember that having a central bank has always been an extremely contentious and controversial topic, which we'll discuss more in greater depth. But what does it mean to have a central bank, and what does the Federal Reserve System really do? Well, the big difference is we currently use what's called a fiat currency system, which means that the U.S. dollar is not pegged to any commodity, like as opposed to, for example, the gold standard, which is where your currency will be pegged to the value of gold, which is a sort of objective placeholder that can, all different people, whether or not you use a U.S. dollar, you can always check the price of gold, and that'll give you the price of the dollar. But of course, we don't do that. We use the fiat, which basically means money is as valuable as we say it is. If you look at the dollar bill, you'll see not only this great Illuminati pyramid and Mason pyramid with the all-seeing eye, or Eye of Horus, you'll also see on the other side, it says this, currency is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. So we used to have currency backed by gold. Now it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. What does that mean? Well, what it really means is basically our military and, police muscle will come mess you up if you don't, if you want to try and go against the economic hegemony that we've set up. And so this is extremely crazy, because you'll see that since the money is just based off what the government says it's worth, and again, the Federal Reserve is not part of the government technically, it's a private corporation, and this is something a lot of people don't understand about the Federal Reserve. They think it's part of the government. It is not. I'm going to say it again. It's a private corporation. That means people are making a profit off of loaning money to the United States government and to us, Americans. And so the way that the Federal Reserve System works is that when the federal government needs money to, do whatever it needs to do, it'll go to the Fed and request a loan, and then the Federal Reserve will reach into its magic checkbook. And I say magic because, again, the money is just coming from the printing press. It's not tied to a commodity. They can just print as much of it as they want, and they say, it's worth this much. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but this is an overview, basic understanding. And of course, the more money you print, inflation goes up and the value goes down. But the point is that they charge interest on the loans that they make to the government. So our government will go to the Federal Reserve, request money, the Federal Reserve will just print it, and then charge interest on that money that it gives to the government, which of course is passed on to us through taxes. So the Federal Reserve System literally charges interest on nothing. They're inventing money out of thin air to loan to the government and then charging interest on the government on that kind of imaginary money, or, it's not imaginary, it's very real, but they just pulled it out of thin air. And this is why the Federal Reserve System is so controversial, because it allows the manipulation of currency values by, this kind of private corporation that has no real oversight. I mean, of course, they'll say that the government is watching over the Fed, but of course it's never been audited. It's a revolving door between the federal government and the people who are working inside the Federal Reserve. So it's really kind of at the heart of the conspiracy that is afflicting the world. And this is a picture comparing the Eccles building on the right, which is the Federal Reserve headquarters, and the Temple of Isis in Egypt. And those of you who have watched some of my other videos know that I'm very interested in symbolism and kind of the way things look. And so I think comparing these two buildings, we can definitely see a sort of similarity in visual style between the architecture of the Eccles building and the Temple of Isis. You see these very strong parallel lines and vertical columns. And I leave it up to your spirit to see if you see the kind of inspiration behind the Eccles building. But the point is that the Federal Reserve has tied into the occult world in a lot of different ways, especially in terms of the Synagogue of Satan, which we'll be discussing more in depth. And those of you who are interested in architecture, I really think it's an important thing to kind of verse ourselves in, because, again, masonry, if you take it literally, is about the laying of bricks and building of buildings. And the Masons themselves believe that they are descended from the builders of Solomon's temple. So the architects and architecture is such an important facet to the conspiracy world. And those who want to kind of go further down the rabbit hole, I recommend looking into the work of I.M. Pei, who was famous for constructing the Louvre Pyramid, among other kind of occult Illuminati buildings. But again, Eccles building, Temple of Isis, the Federal Reserve is kind of the head temple of the economic cult that has really taken over our government. And, this is nothing new. This is an old conspiracy. And here we have some German propaganda that's basically identifying the Freemasons and the Synagogue of Satan as being responsible for the various social unrest in Europe. And some may be, shocked that I'm using German propaganda in these videos, but I want to, first off, condemn the Nazis and the German fascist history, because anyone familiar with that tradition knows that they are extremely involved in the occult and devil worship and Germanic paganism and Black Sun, etc., etc. So the Germans and the Nazis were definitely evil, but I also want to dispel the notion that we're kind of taught that throughout history it's always the good guys versus the bad guys, the Allies versus the Axis, when in reality, both sides are evil, and it's the good people are usually just the regular citizens just caught in the crossfire, helpless to do anything, while these kind of massive conspiracies and occult forces kind of duke it out on the grand scale. So I say that both sides are corrupt, and that's the kind of real enlightening perspective, I think, when we realize that nobody is above doing evil things, and we need to kind of come together and realize that as regular citizens, we're the ones losing. It's the people in power who are the real ones causing all this trouble. And again, if you want to interpret these symbols, here's the Temple of Solomon, which is identifiable by the checkerboard tile and the two pillars, towers, Boaz and Jachin. And then here's the square and compass for Freemason, and the hexagram, which again, people will say it's the Star of David. I think that's a misnomer. It's either the Seal of Solomon or the hexagram, which is derived, of course, from the hexagon, which has 6 sides. And then, of course, we know 6 is extremely important in numerology. And then 3, 3, add 3, 3 together, you get 6, of course, et cetera, et cetera. And JFK was another really important, he might have been one of the last great presidents in the U.S. because he was aware of the Federal Reserve and the danger that it posed. And again, killing Kennedy is one of the biggest conspiracies ever, and the mystery surrounding that. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, you know, JFK was killed by the banking cartel because he wanted to take the United States off the Federal Reserve system, and they could not allow that because, you know, that was the kind of seat of their power. And after World War II and after the Axis was defeated, we kind of set up the basis of the new global economic system at Bretton Woods. And this is a photograph from the hotel at Bretton Woods, where the kind of future of the United States and the world's economic policy was set up with the creation of the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO, which are all basically kind of take the same concept of the Federal Reserve and apply it on a global level, more or less. And the United States, we got 2 major victories and 2 big rewards for winning World War II, the first being our military bases, which are throughout the world, and the second being having the US dollar as our world reserve currency. And what that means is that right now the dollar occupies the kind of placeholder role in the world market, which is basically means that all the other different currencies, whether it's, you know, rubles or euros or pounds or whatever it is, they're all pegged to the dollar amount. That's why it's the reserve currency. And of course, this ties back to the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve has control over how much a dollar is worth, because they have the ability to do what's called either qualitative easing, which is basically fancy talk for printing a lot of money and lowering the value of the dollar through inflation, or all these other little tricks that they can do to manipulate the currency value. And this is always something that kind of precludes volatility. And you look at the markets and you can see that we're really kind of walking on a razor's edge, and it's a roller coaster ride because it's designed that way. The people at top are not interested in creating wealth for the rest of us. They just want to ensure that the vice grip that they have over the financial institution and the political institutions that it can buy gets tighter. And so this is another great cartoon from the 19th century of Andrew Jackson, who was known as a great opponent of the bank. And here you can see again more serpents, and those of you familiar with my other videos know that anytime we see serpents or reptiles or scaly things, we need to kind of pay attention. And in this cartoon, it's basically the banking industry and the financial world is represented as this hydra, this many-headed serpent that, you know, Andrew Jackson is fighting against. And you know, he was actually successful at the time. There was a movement during Jackson's presidency to have a central bank of the United States, and Jackson was able to lead the movement against it, but of course it did not ultimately defeat the serpent. It merely delayed its victory, or semi-victory, with the Federal Reserve, which came about 100 years later. And we continue to see how the Federal Reserve, as the kind of central bank from the United States, sort of is in collusion with all these smaller banks throughout the world. And the point of this slide is you can see the banking logos of several different banks, the first one being the Royal Bank of Scotland, which of course we know Scottish Rite Masonry is extremely important. So anything about banking in Scotland we should pay attention to. And I think also if you go on their website and you ask the reasoning behind this particular logo that the Royal Bank of Scotland used, they'll say it has to do with 6 rows of 6 coins, which is like 6 by 6, so 666. Again, it's like these sort of things, once you know where to look, you'll start to see these numerology, you'll start to see certain numbers pop up, you'll start to see certain symbols pop up, if we just train our minds to kind of be aware of them. And so then the next circle is the One West Bank, then of course Chase Bank, and then the Illuminati, which is at the center of this conspiracy. And even the Bible predicts us again about these evil eyes and all these circular motifs that we see throughout all the different banking logos. I think some people might dismiss it as a coincidence, but those of you familiar with my videos, again, I'm definitely not one to dismiss things as coincidental. And I think that we should be skeptical. It's like, why are they all using a similar sign? And you know, we really need to be aware that the banking world has a very checkered past and a very controversial history behind it. And here we're just focusing on the Chase Bank logo, and you can actually see that there's kind of a swastika hidden in the negative space, and I've included the swastika on this slide so you can see it easier, but included in the negative space of these kind of 4 blue shapes is a white swastika, or that shape, which is an ancient symbol and one that's very important in the occult world. And of course, we know that the Rockefeller family was, has an unseemly connection with Nazi Germany through Standard Oil, and of course, the Rockefellers are also the power behind Chase Bank. So when you start to really put the pieces together, you can see that the Nazis, the Allies, all the kind of major political players of the 20th century have been corrupted by this kind of international banking conspiracy. And David Rockefeller, the current generation, has been very open about his plans for one world government. And this is a quote taken from his biography, which again, he says that he's proud of the work that he's done to kind of ensure one world government. And again, the conspiracy is so vast, and the thing I like about this slide is it shows a bunch of the logos, and those of you who have an eye for symbolism will have a good time interpreting the various symbols on this slide, but just some obvious ones right here. Of course, we have Skull and Bones, Bohemian Club, Trilateral Commission, Club of Rome, Freemasons. All these groups have an internationalist, one world government kind of perspective, but the interesting thing about them is just because all these organizations are within this elite group and are interested in controlling the world doesn't mean that they all get along. There are factions within the elite. I think this is such an important concept to understand because people will say, oh, well, it's impossible for any one group or any one person to control the world. And I would say that that's a very wise perspective, but we need to remember that it's possible to have a kind of class of people, an upper elite class, and then there'll be divisions within that class, but they all agree that the rest of us who are not in that class are just pawns in their game. So specifically what I mean is, for example, the CIA and the Jesuits and the Vatican are kind of one faction within the elite, and they kind of trace their lineage back through the Knights Templar, and this all goes back to the Crusades and even before that. But that's kind of one side, and then of course there's the Masons and the Zionists and that faction. And of course, those of you who are familiar with the Freemasons and the original Bavarian Illuminati, one of the goals of them was to overthrow the Pope. And so you kind of have a kind of Catholic, well, neither of these groups, again, are truly Catholic or Protestant because they're liars. They don't really worship God. They worship the devil. But you have the kind of cultural Catholicism on one side in this conspiracy, and then you have a cultural kind of Protestantism or Judaism on another side, and these groups will compete against each other. It's very similar to kind of medieval courtly society where you have these various powerful families all jockeying for control. And of course they'll socialize with each other and they'll pretend to be friends, but of course they're really plotting to see who can become the top dog, which is exactly what is going on a bigger scale in the elite. And Christ warns us about this, is that the demons and the evil forces in the world there's a multitude of them, but we don't need to be worried about that because we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. And we need to remember that the biggest knowledge or the biggest weapon we have against this conspiracy is our faith in God and the knowledge that He will give us if we kind of approach him with faith, and we can learn about this conspiracy, and we can do what we can to fight against it. And that's ultimately why I'm so grateful for everyone who watches these videos, because we all want to kind of arm ourselves with the knowledge of what's really going on in the world. So I thank you so much for spending this time with me. I pray that God blesses your life.